Part II, Combray, Section 2. When Françoise, having seen that my parents had everything they required, first went upstairs again to give my aunt her pepsin, and to find out from her what she would take for luncheon, very few mornings passed but she was called upon to give an opinion, or to furnish an explanation in regard to some important event. Just fancy, Françoise, Madame Goupil went by more than a quarter of an hour late to fetch her sister. If she loses any more time on the way, I should not be at all surprised if she got in after the elevation. Well, there'd be nothing wonderful in that, would be the answer. Or, Françoise, if you had come in 5 minutes ago, you would have seen Madame Imbert go past with some asparagus twice the size of what Mother Callot has. Do try to find out from her cook where she got them. You know you've been putting asparagus in all your sauces this spring. You might be able to get some like these for our visitors. I shouldn't be surprised if they came from the Curé's, Françoise would say, and "I'm sure you wouldn't, my poor Françoise," my aunt would reply, raising her shoulders. "From the Curé's, indeed! You know quite well that he can never grow anything but wretched little twigs of asparagus, not asparagus at all. I tell you these ones were as thick as my arm, not your arm, of course, but my poor arm, which has grown so much thinner again this year." Or, "Françoise, didn't you hear that bell just now? It split my head." "No, Madame Octave." "Ah, poor girl, your skull must be very thick. You may thank God for that. It was Maguillon come to fetch Dr. Pipeyrot. He came out with her at once, and they went off along the Rue de l'Oiseau. There must be some child ill." "Oh, dear, dear," the poor little creature would come with a sigh from Françoise, who could not hear of any calamity befalling a person unknown to her, even in some distant part of the world, without beginning to lament. Or, "Françoise, for whom did they toll the passing bell just now? Oh dear, of course, it would be for Madame Rousseau, and to think that I had forgotten that she passed away the other night. Indeed, it is time the Lord called me home, too. I don't know what has become of my head since I lost my poor Octave, but I am wasting your time, my good girl." "Indeed, no, Madame Octave. My time is not so precious. Whoever made our time didn't sell it to us. I am just going to see that my fire hasn't gone out." In this way Françoise and my aunt made a critical valuation between them, in the course of these morning sessions, of the earliest happenings of the day. But sometimes these happenings assumed so mysterious or so alarming an air that my aunt felt she could not wait until it was time for Françoise to come upstairs, and then a formidable and quadruple peal would resound through the house. "But, Madame Octave, it is not time for your pepsin," Françoise would begin. "Are you feeling faint?" "No, thank you, Françoise," my aunt would reply. "That is to say, yes. For you know well that there is very seldom a time when I don't feel faint. One day I shall pass away like Madame Rousseau before I know where I am. But that is not why I rang. Would you believe that I have just seen, as plainly as I see you, Madame Goupil with a little girl I didn't know at all? Run and get a pennyworth of salt from Camus. It is not often that Theodore cannot tell you who a person is." "But that must be Monsieur Pupin's daughter," Françoise would say, preferring to stick to an immediate explanation, since she had been perhaps twice already into Camus's shop that morning. "Monsieur Pupin's daughter? Oh, that's a likely story, my poor Françoise. Do you think I should not have recognized Monsieur Pupin's daughter?" "But I don't mean the big one, Madame Octave. I mean the little girl, the one who goes to school at Jouy. I seem to have seen her once already this morning." "Oh, if that's what it is," my aunt would say, "she must have come over for the holidays. Yes, that is it. No need to ask. She will have come over for the holidays. But then we shall soon see Madame Sazerat come along and ring her sister's doorbell for her luncheon. That will be it. I saw the boy from Galopin's go by with a tart. You will see that the tart was for Madame Goupil." "Once Madame Goupil has any one in the house, Madame Octave, you won't be long in seeing all her folk going in to their luncheon there, for it's not so early as it was," would be the answer. For Françoise, who was anxious to retire downstairs to look after our own meal, was not sorry to leave my aunt with the prospect of such a distraction. "Oh, not before midday," my aunt would reply in a tone of resignation, darting an uneasy glance at the clock, but stealthily, so as not to let it be seen that she, who had renounced all earthly joys, yet found a keen satisfaction in learning that Madame Goupil was expecting company to luncheon. though, alas, she must wait a little more than an hour still before enjoying the spectacle. "And it will come in the middle of my luncheon," she would murmur to herself. Her luncheon was such a distraction in itself that she did not like any other to come at the same time. "At least you will not forget to give me my creamed eggs on one of the flat plates." These were the only plates which had pictures on them, and my aunt used to amuse herself at every meal by reading the description on whichever might have been sent up to her. She would put on her spectacles and spell out Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Aladdin, or the Wonderful Lamp, and smile and say, "Very good indeed." "I may as well go across to Camus," Françoise would hazard, seeing that my aunt had no longer any intention of sending her there. "No, no, it's not worth while now. It's certain to be the Pupin girl. My poor Françoise, I am sorry to have made you come upstairs for nothing." But it was not for nothing, as my aunt well knew, that she had rung for Françoise, since at Combray a person whom one didn't know at all was as incredible a being as any mythological deity. And it was apt to be forgotten that after each occasion on which there had appeared in the Rue de Saint Esprit or in the Square one of these bewildering phenomena, careful and exhaustive researches had invariably reduced the fabulous monster to the proportions of a person whom one did know, either personally or in the abstract, in his or her civil status as being more or less closely related to some family in Combray. It would turn out to be Madame Sauton's son discharged from the army, or the Abbé Pedro's niece come home from her convent, or the curé's brother, a tax collector at Châteaudun, who had just retired on a pension, or had come over to Combray for the holidays. On first noticing them, you have been impressed by the thought that there might be in Combray people whom you didn't know at all, simply because you had failed to recognize or identify them at once. And yet long beforehand Madame Sauton and the curé had given warning that they expected their strangers. In the evening, when I came in and went upstairs to tell my aunt the incidents of our walk, if I was rash enough to say to her that we had passed, near the Pont Vieux, a man whom my grandfather didn't know. "A man grandfather didn't know at all!" she would exclaim. "That's a likely story!" None the less she would be a little disturbed by the news. She would wish to have the details correctly, and so my grandfather would be summoned. "Who can it have been that you passed near the Pont Vieux, uncle? A man you didn't know at all?" "Why, of course I did," my grandfather would answer. "It was Prosper, Madame Bouleboeuf's gardener's brother." "Ah, well," my aunt would say, calm again but slightly flushed still, "and the boy told me that you had passed a man you didn't know at all," after which I would be warned to be more careful of what I said, and not to upset my aunt by so thoughtless remarks. Every one was so well known in Combray, animals as well as people, that if my aunt had happened to see a dog go by which she didn't know at all, she would think about it incessantly, devoting to the solution of the incomprehensible problem all her inductive talent and her leisure hours. "That will be Madame Sazerat's dog," Françoise would suggest, without any real conviction, but in the hope of peace, and so that my aunt should not split her head. As if I didn't know Madame Sazerat's dog! For my aunt's critical mind would not so easily admit any fresh fact. "Ah, but that will be the new dog Monsieur Galopin has brought her from Lisieux." "Oh, if that's what it is!" "It seems it's a most engaging animal," Françoise would go on, having got the story from Theodore. "As clever as a Christian, always in a good temper, always friendly, always everything that's nice. It's not often you see an animal so well behaved at that age. Madame Octave, it's high time I left you. I can't afford to stay here amusing myself. Look! It's nearly 10 o'clock, and my fire not lighted yet, and I've still to dress the asparagus." "What, Françoise? More asparagus? It's a regular disease of asparagus you have got this year. You will make our Parisians sick of it." "No, no, Madame Octave, they like it well enough. They'll be coming back from church soon, as hungry as hunters, and they won't eat it out of the back of their spoons, you'll see." "Church? Why, they must be there now. You'd better not lose any time. Go and look after your luncheon." While my aunt gossiped on in this way with Françoise, I would have accompanied my parents to Mass. How I loved it! How clearly I can see it still, our church at Combray. The old porch by which we went in, black and full of holes as a colander, was worn out of shape and deeply furrowed at the sides, as also was the holy water stoup to which it led us. just as if the gentle grazing touch of the cloaks of peasant women going into the church, and of their fingers dipping into the water, had managed by age-long repetition to acquire a destructive force, to impress itself on the stone, to carve ruts in it like those made by cart-wheels upon stone gate-posts against which they are driven every day. Its memorial stones, beneath which the noble dust of the abbots of Combray, who were buried there, furnished the choir with a sort of spiritual pavement, were themselves no longer hard and lifeless matter, for time had softened and sweetened them, and had made them melt like honey and flow beyond their proper margins, either surging out in a milky, frothing wave, washing from its place a florid Gothic capital, drowning the white violets of the marble floor, or else reabsorbed into their limits, contracting still further a crabbed Latin inscription, bringing a fresh touch of fantasy into the arrangement of its curtailed characters, closing together two letters of some word of which the rest were disproportionately scattered. Its windows were never so brilliant as on days when the sun scarcely shone, so that if it was dull outside you might be certain of fine weather in church. One of them was filled from top to bottom by a solitary figure, like the king on a playing card, who lived up there beneath his canopy of stone, between earth and heaven, and in the blue light of its slanting shadow, on week-days sometimes, at noon, when there was no service, at one of those rare moments when the airy, empty church, more human somehow, and more luxurious with the sun showing off all its rich furnishings, seemed to have almost a habitable air, like the hall, all sculptured stone and painted glass, of some medieval mansion. You might see Madame Sazerat kneel for an instant, laying down on the chair beside her own a neatly corded parcel of little cakes, which she had just bought at the baker's and was taking home for her luncheon. In another, a mountain of rosy snow, at whose foot a battle was being fought, seemed to have frozen the window also, which it swelled and distorted with its cloudy sleep, like a pane to which snowflakes have drifted and clung, but flakes illumined by a sunrise, the same, doubtless, which purpled the reredos of the altar with tints so fresh that they seemed rather to be thrown on it for a moment by a light shining from outside, and shortly to be extinguished than painted, and permanently fastened on the stone. And all of them were so old that you could see here and there their silvery antiquity sparkling with the dust of centuries, and showing in its threadbare brilliance the very chords of their lovely tapestry of glass. There was one among them which was a tall panel composed of 100 little rectangular windows, of blue principally, like a great game of patience of the kind planned to beguile King Charles VI. But, either because a ray of sunlight had gleamed through it, or because my own shifting vision had drawn across the window, whose colors died away and were rekindled by turns, a rare and transient fire, the next instant it had taken on all the iridescence of a peacock's tail, then shook and wavered in a flaming and fantastic shower, distilled and dropping from the groin of the dark and rocky vault down the moist walls, as though it were along the bed of some rainbow grotto of sinuous stalactites that I was following my parents, who marched before me, their prayer books clasped in their hands. A moment later the little lozenge windows had put on the deep transparence, the unbreakable hardness of sapphires clustered on some enormous breastplate, but beyond which could be distinguished, dearer than all such treasures, a fleeting smile from the sun, which could be seen and felt as well here, in the blue and gentle flood in which it washed the masonry, as on the pavement of the square or the straw of the market-place, and even on our first Sundays, when we came down before Easter, it would console me for the blackness and bareness of the earth outside by making burst into blossom, as in some springtime in old history among the airs of St. Louis, this dazzling and gilded carpet of forget-me-nots in glass. Two tapestries of high warp represented the coronation of Esther, in which tradition would have it that the weaver had given to Ahasuerus the features of one of the kings of France, and to Esther those of a lady of Guermantes, whose lover he had been. Their colors had melted into one another so as to add expression, relief, light to the pictures. A touch of red over the lips of Esther had strayed beyond their outline. The yellow on her dress was spread with such unctuous plumpness as to have acquired a kind of solidity, and stood boldly out from the receding atmosphere, while the green of the trees, which was still bright in silk and wool among the lower parts of the panel, but had quite gone at the top, separated in a paler scheme above the dark trunks, the yellowing upper branches, tanned and half obliterated by the sharp though sidelong rays of an invisible sun. All these things, and still more than these, the treasures which had come to the church from personages who to me were almost legendary figures, such as the golden cross wrought, it was said, by Saint Eloy and presented by Dagobert, and the tomb of the sons of Louis the Germanic in porphyry and enameled copper, because of which I used to go forward into the church when we were making our way to our chairs, as into a fairy-haunted valley, where the rustic sees with amazement on a rock, a tree, a marsh, the tangible proofs of the little people's supernatural passage. All these things made of the church for me something entirely different from the rest of the town, a building which occupied, so to speak, four dimensions of space, the name of the fourth being time, which had sailed the centuries with that old nave, where bay after bay, chapel after chapel, seemed to stretch across and hold down and conquer not merely a few yards of soil, but each successive epoch from which the whole building had emerged triumphant, hiding the rugged barbarities of the 11th century in the thickness of its walls, through which nothing could be seen of the heavy arches, long stopped and blinded with coarse blocks of ashlar, except where, near the porch, a deep groove was furrowed into one wall by the tower stair, and even there the barbarity was veiled by the graceful Gothic arcade which pressed coquettishly upon it, like a row of grown-up sisters who, to hide him from the eyes of strangers, arranged themselves smilingly in front of a countrified, unmannerly, and ill-dressed younger brother, rearing into the sky above the square a tower which had looked down upon St. Louis, and seemed to behold him still, and thrusting down with its crypt into the blackness of a Merovingian night, through which, guiding us with groping finger-tips, beneath the shadowy vault, ribbed strongly as an immense bat's wing of stone, Theodore or his sister would light up for us with a candle the tomb of Sigebert's little daughter, in which a deep hole, like the bed of a fossil, had been bored, or so it was said, by a crystal lamp, which on the night when the Frankish princess was murdered, had left of its own accord the golden chains by which it was suspended where the apse is today, and with neither the crystal broken nor the light extinguished, had buried itself in the stone through which it had gently forced its way. And then the apse of Combray. What am I to say of that? It was so coarse, so devoid of artistic beauty, even of the religious spirit. From outside, since the street crossing which it commanded was on a lower level, its great wall was thrust upwards from a basement of unfaced ashlar, jagged with flints, in all of which there was nothing particularly ecclesiastical. The windows seemed to have been pierced at an abnormal height, and its whole appearance was that of a prison wall rather than that of a church. And certainly, in later years, were I to recall all the glorious apses that I had seen, it would never enter my mind to compare with any one of them the apse of Combray. Only one day, turning out of a little street in some country town, I came upon three alleyways that converged, and facing them an old wall, rubbed, worn, crumbling, and unusually high, with windows pierced in it, far overhead, and the same asymmetrical appearance as the apse of Combray. And at that moment I did not say to myself, as at Chartres I might have done, or at Rheims, with what strength the religious feeling had been expressed in its construction, but instinctively I exclaimed, "The Church!" End of Part 2, Section 2.